On June 29, 2013, 35-year-old Larry Wells woke up at 3 a.m., slipping out of his bed quietly so he wouldn't wake up his wife. Larry's wife was 3 months pregnant, and raising their 4-year-old daughter was already a full-time job for her, so Larry wanted to be sure that she got all the sleep she needed. After climbing out of bed, Larry slipped into his work clothes that he had laid out the night before, and then he tiptoed through the house out to his car. Larry drove for about 5 minutes through the desolate streets of Hamburg, which is a quiet suburb just outside of Buffalo, New York. And at this hour, pretty much every business in town was closed, so it was very quiet and peaceful. Larry eventually turned into a large parking lot and pulled into a parking space. He got out of his car and began walking toward the big, sprawling building at the center of the lot. And as he walked towards it, he glanced up at the sign above the entrance of the building, and as he looked, he smiled. This sign represented something that had deep roots in Larry's childhood and also now an important place in Larry's adult life. That sign's multicolored letters spelled out Toys R Us. Toys R Us was a very popular toy store chain in the United States at the time, and it's where Larry had worked for the last 7 years. Larry loved kids, and for a while he had wanted to become a teacher. He had actually studied education and even got a master's degree, but after graduate school, he couldn't find a full-time teaching job, so he wound up working as a substitute teacher. But at the time, Larry and his wife wanted to start a family and move into a new house, so that's when Larry decided to get a job working at Toys R Us to supplement his income. At first, Larry thought of his job at Toys R Us as just being a sort of placeholder job, something to have until he got hired on as a full-time teacher somewhere. But it turned out Larry sort of loved working there. He got to regularly interact with children, which he loved doing, and also his fun-loving personality and solid work ethic just made him a perfect fit for the company. And so pretty quickly, Larry took a lot of pride in his job at Toys R Us, and all of his coworkers there adored him, and by the time he and his wife had their first child in 2009, Larry had been promoted to store manager. This was his career. And because Larry cared so much about this job and about Toys R Us, he would often start work at 4 a.m. on Saturday mornings just to help the stockers unload the merchandise trucks, even though he didn't have to do that. And that's exactly what he was doing on this particular Saturday morning, showing up early to lend a helping hand. And so Larry walked up to the front door of the Toys R Us building, and waiting outside were 2 of his employees, Cindy Barone and Isaac Millette Lloyd. The building was locked, so Larry pulled out his keys, unlocked the door, slid it open, and let the 2 workers inside. Larry walked in after them and then slid the door shut and locked it back up, because the store wasn't actually scheduled to open for another several hours. Cindy and Isaac made their way over to the time clock and punched in, then they picked up their walkie-talkies, which they clipped to their belts, and they began their shifts. As for Larry, he headed straight to the storeroom, opened up the back door for the merchandise truck driver, and then began helping the driver unload the truck. And then at some point, Cindy and Isaac came over, and they grabbed pallets of this merchandise from the back, and then wheeled those pallets into the store on dollies. Isaac took his pallet to his section of the store, while Cindy took her merchandise pallet to the next section over. And then both of them got to work restocking the shelves, which had been thinned out by the Friday night rush. By 4:30 a.m., the truck was fully unloaded, so Larry let the driver back out of the building and then locked the back door after him. At this point, Larry, Cindy, and Isaac were now working in separate parts of the building, and they couldn't see each other, but they could communicate using their walkie-talkie radios. And you need to keep in mind that this particular Toys R Us store was massive, over 41,000 square feet. And so really it was normal, if you were working in off-hour shifts, to basically not see anybody else physically, and just basically talk to them on your walkie-talkie. A little before 5 a.m., so about 30 minutes later, an employee named Anthony Armstrong stood outside the front entrance, pulled out his cell phone, and called his manager, Larry, and told him he was outside the store, ready to start his shift, and could he come over and unlock the door. And so Larry made his way to the front door, he opened it up, let Anthony inside, and then slid the door shut and locked it back up. About 10 minutes after that, another employee named Richard Shepard approached the front door of the Toys R Us and also called Larry so he could be let in the building. But this time, Larry's phone just rang several times and went to voicemail. So Richard sent Larry a text message and then waited a minute for a reply, hoping he would reply soon, but he didn't. And so as Richard is just sort of standing there, he pressed his face against the glass and peered into the store to look for any movement, thinking maybe he could, bang on the door and get one of the other employees' attention so they could let him in. But he didn't see anybody. So, feeling sort of frustrated, Richard stepped away from the door and walked east towards the Babies R Us side of the building, which had a separate entrance from the main store, and when he got there, he found one of the sliding doors at Babies R Us was wide open. Now, this really surprised Richard, because the company had very strict loss prevention policies that required all doors to remain locked during non-business hours. But this was actually kind of lucky for him, because now he was able to just stroll right into the store without needing anyone to help him inside. And so once he was in, Richard clocked in and began his shift stocking shelves in his section. Now, at this point, Richard still hadn't seen anybody else, and he did think it was kind of eerie to be all alone in this vast fluorescent-lit store before the sun had even come up. A few sections over from Richard, Isaac was still stocking his shelves, and he was taking his time as usual because Isaac was meticulous and took great pride in his work. He also really liked Larry as a manager, and so he always tried to do a really good job when Larry was around because he wanted to impress Larry. Cindy, on the other hand, was actually almost done stocking her section, but it wasn't because she was lazy, it was because she had worked at Toys R Us longer than a lot of the other employees, and so she knew the merchandise inside and out, and she could basically make her way through the entire giant store with her eyes closed, and so she was just really quick. As the hour wore on, all the employees kept plugging away, sort of independent of each other, and outside, as the sky turned from pitch black to a pale blue as the sun rose, the lights in the parking lot switched off for the day. Isaac looked outside and noticed the sun coming up, and he knew the store was going to be opening in just a couple of hours, and he still had more merchandise that he would need to put out onto the shelves. So he wheeled his now empty pallet to the back of the store into the stockroom, and he was about to load up another full pallet of merchandise when he suddenly heard a noise coming from inside the store. It was a repetitive noise, like a wailing sound, but sort of flat and robotic. At first, just because Isaac didn't know what the sound was, he simply tried to ignore it and just focus on his work. But the sound just kept going on, and nobody seemed to be turning it off, and that's when Isaac realized this was actually an alarm going off inside the store. And so Isaac stopped what he was doing, and he pulled out his radio, and he pressed the button and said, "Hey Larry, there's an alarm going off in the store, can you please turn it off?" But a minute went by, and the alarm still kept going, and there were no responses from Larry on the radio. And so Isaac turned the channel on his radio and radioed everyone in the store and asked for someone to please go find Larry and please get him to turn off that alarm. Cindy happened to be closest to the manager's office at the front of the store when Isaac made this radio call, and so Cindy replied into the radio that she would go see if Larry was in his office. Shortly after that, Isaac emerged from the stockroom, pulling behind him a pallet of merchandise, and as he did, suddenly a woman's scream echoed through the entire store, and then Isaac heard this woman sobbing and shouting, "Oh my God! Oh my God!" Isaac had never heard Cindy scream or cry before, so at first, he wasn't even sure if it was her. He just felt completely disoriented. And then Isaac saw his coworker Anthony rushing towards the manager's office, and so Isaac followed behind. Outside the office, both men saw Cindy crying and shaking, and in between sobs, she said she needed to call 911, and then she rushed past them, picked up a phone from one of the checkout lanes, and dialed. At this point, Richard, the employee who had shown up last, rushed up the aisle to where Isaac and Anthony were now standing, and the three men just sort of looked at each other, confused and frightened, and then, without a better plan, they just walked into the manager's office, and immediately it became clear why Cindy was so upset. Their manager, Larry, was slumped over in his chair, bleeding profusely from a hole in his chest. Isaac reflexively called out to Larry, but Larry didn't respond. The only sound in the office was a loud pulsing screech from the phone receiver, which had been left off the hook. And so the three men just turned and ran out of the office over to Cindy, who by this point was on the phone with 911, totally hysterical, screaming into the phone that their manager had been shot and she wasn't sure if he was alive or dead. The Hamburg Police Department received word from dispatch of a shooting with a possible active shooter scenario at the Toys R Us, and so every police unit in town busted a U-turn and sped in their cruisers straight for the store. Now, the 911 operator had told Cindy that the police were going to be there soon, and so everybody in the store needed to exit immediately and wait in the parking lot. So minutes later, the police arrived at the store, they saw the four employees outside waiting for them, and so after moving the employees across the street to a safe location, the police went inside the store ready to potentially engage with an active shooter. because nobody knew for sure what the situation really was. Was there still an armed shooter inside somewhere? Or maybe had they left the store and they were on the loose in the area? Nobody knew. Detective Sergeant Scott Cascino was still at home and barely awake when he got the call about the shooting, and he found himself feeling totally confused and wondering if he had even heard correctly. Like, the idea that there was a shooting inside of a Toys R Us at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning in Hamburg, of all places, just seemed impossible. Cascino was a veteran detective who knew that the town of Hamburg had very little violent crime. So as he quickly got dressed and hopped into his police-issued vehicle and drove to the Toys R Us, he really didn't know what to expect. When Cascino arrived at Toys R Us and parked his car in the lot, he watched as the other police officers who had already arrived began carefully advancing towards the building with their guns drawn. Those officers would slowly make their way through the store looking for anybody, but finding no one, before finally getting to the manager's office, where they went inside and they saw what Cindy had seen. Larry, all alone inside, slumped over in his chair. The police called out Larry's name several times, but he was unresponsive. One of the officers walked over to him and pressed his fingers into Larry's wrist, and he turned to his colleagues and signaled that Larry did still have a pulse. But the officers saw all the blood on the floor and they could barely hear Larry's breathing, and so they agreed they basically had no time to waste here in getting this man medical attention. And so the officers just grabbed Larry by the shoulders and dragged him out of his office, through the store, and out the front door, right to a waiting ambulance. 2 EMTs lifted Larry onto a gurney, they strapped him down, and then placed him into the back of the ambulance, and then the EMTs hopped in with him, closed the doors, and the ambulance sped off towards the hospital. And as that ambulance sped across town, the EMTs in the back worked on Larry, trying to compress the wound in his chest and get the bleeding to stop. The EMTs noticed that in addition to the huge hole in Larry's chest, there was another wound in his shoulder, but comparatively speaking, it was not nearly as big of a deal as the chest wound. And then as the EMTs continued doing their work, they realized, these wounds were not gunshot wounds, they were knife wounds. Larry had been stabbed. However, despite all the efforts made by these EMTs to try to save Larry, he would unfortunately pass away from his wounds when they were only about halfway to the hospital. Back at the Toys R Us, police had set up a perimeter around the property, and then the SWAT team arrived. The SWAT team then searched both inside and outside the building, and then reported to Detective Cascino that they didn't find anything or anyone that was suspicious, and so at this point, all investigators were clear to now enter the building. It was also around this time that Detective Cascino and the rest of the first responders learned that the victim had died on the way to the hospital, and that contrary to what the initial theory had been, that he had not been shot, he had been stabbed to death. Cascino and crime scene investigators proceeded into the Toys R Us and headed directly into the manager's office, where Larry had been found. Once inside, everything was carefully swabbed for DNA and dusted for fingerprints, and as they did this, investigators were careful not to step in the long streak of Larry's blood that had been left there on the ground when the police had dragged him out. There was also a security DVR on the table. It was where footage from all the store's security cameras was fed and recorded onto a hard drive. And very clearly, the power cord to that security DVR had been unplugged and pulled away from the wall. Cascino had a hunch that one of the employees who had been working that morning was Larry's killer, and the footage from the surveillance cameras around the property may very well reveal which one it was. So getting this DVR connected and reviewing the footage on it from the surveillance cameras would be crucial. At this point, the 4 employees who had been there that morning, Cindy, Isaac, Anthony, and Richard, were the primary suspects in this murder, and so Cascino and his team quickly separated them so they could all be interviewed individually. Investigators put Isaac in the passenger seat of one of the police cruisers, and Cascino sat in the car with him. And the first thing Cascino noticed was how Isaac was trembling and tripping over his words. And so Isaac's nervousness and his inability to answer questions clearly made him seem suspicious, and so did the behavior of Anthony Armstrong, who was the youngest member of the employee crew. He completely clammed up during his interview and refused to answer questions, so that raised a red flag too. Then, detectives questioned Cindy, who was the one who actually found Larry's body, and she was cooperative and helped investigators develop a timeline for the events of the morning, but critically, during her interview, she made it very clear that Anthony was the last person to see Larry alive. Then, investigators learned that the final employee, Richard Shepard, was late for work that morning. And when detectives asked him why, Richard explained that he had stopped at the 24-hour grocery store to buy a drink and some snacks to help him get through his shift. Richard then recounted that when he had gotten to work that morning, he had tried calling Larry to open the door for him, but there was no response, and so he wound up entering through another door, the Babies R Us door, that just happened to be wide open. And then Richard explained that, that in and of itself was very unusual because they were all under strict orders to keep the doors locked at all times during non-business hours. And so the investigators finished up their initial interviews with the 4 Toys R Us employees who were there that morning, but they told them they would still need to stick around a bit longer. At about noon, the Toys R Us regional manager of loss prevention for the area, Bernie Grusha, came out to the store. Toys R Us corporate had contacted him and sent him out here to try to be as helpful as possible with the investigation. Kashino saw Grusha arrive, walked over and introduced himself, and then a few minutes later asked Grusha to come into the manager's office to try to help the investigators view the store's security footage. Once inside the office, Grusha just plugged the DVR back into the wall and then got the system up and running. Kashino looked at his notes and saw that Cindy said she had arrived at the store shortly before 4 a.m. So Kashino asked Grusha to please wind the security footage back to about 3:45 a.m. And so Grusha pulled up the security video at 3:45 a.m., and then very slowly, the detectives began examining footage from each of the store's more than a dozen security cameras from 3:45 onward. And as they did this, Kashino, who was right nearby, pulled out his notebook and began writing down the exact time at which he saw the employees show up at work on this video, and then he compared the security footage timestamp to the timelines that each of the employees had given him. And also, Kashino took note of where in the store specifically each employee was working during the first 2 hours of their shifts. On the video, Kashino saw Larry, Isaac, and Cindy all entering the store at 3:55 a.m. And then a few minutes later, Larry could be seen in the back of the store, letting that truck driver inside the building so they could offload merchandise. And then, at exactly 4:24 a.m., Kashino noticed some movement from the camera inside of the Babies R Us department that was pointed toward the front door of the building. And so Kashino asked Grusha to please bring that specific video into full frame. And once that video was maximized, the investigators saw a dark figure standing right outside the front door to Babies R Us for about 30 seconds. This figure appeared to struggle with the lock before the door suddenly opened and they walked inside and disappeared somewhere inside the store. Kashino turned to Grusha and said it sort of looked like the person in the video had jimmied or pried the door open, and Grusha agreed. Kashino directed Grusha to pull up the global view, which would allow them to see all of the cameras at once. This would let them track this mysterious figure's movements through the store. The investigators watched on the global view as this figure disappeared from one camera's view and then popped up in another, but as they watched, it became pretty clear that this person was doing their best to avoid being in front of the cameras. They were snaking and dodging their way through the store, hiding behind shelves wherever they could. They were acting really sketchy. But more than that, what seemed really apparent to Kashino and Grusha and the other investigators was that this person on the video camera clearly seemed to know the layout of the store and exactly where the hidden cameras inside the building were positioned. At one point, when the intruder walked across one of the camera's field of vision and was relatively easy to see, Kashino asked Grusha to pause the camera and zoom in on this person to get a better look. And as soon as Grusha did this, it was clear to investigators that this person was trying very hard to disguise their identity. The figure had this dark thing wrapped around their face like a scarf. They had all dark clothing on, including dark sweatpants with lettering down the left pant leg, and they were wearing a two-toned baseball cap. But by far the most chilling thing about this figure was what they appeared to be holding in their right hand. It looked very much like they were carrying a large knife. But despite all this, the security video was grainy and low resolution, especially zoomed in, so nobody in the room could make out any of the figure's facial features. The investigators couldn't even make out if this was a man or a woman, and it was also impossible to tell what the lettering on the side of their sweatpants said. And so eventually, Grusha zoomed back out and resumed playing the footage, and everyone in the room watched as this mysterious figure made their way to the front of the store. They moved along the front wall, and then at exactly 4:32 a.m., the figure entered the manager's office. And shortly after that, the security video cut out. And so the running assumption amongst the investigators was that, this intruder must have pulled the plug on the DVR, and that's why it cut. Kashino asked Grusha to rewind the surveillance footage and play it back from the point that figure entered the store. They cycled through the video again, and then once more, slowing it down and zooming in on the intruder again. And eventually, it dawned on one of the investigators that the two-tone baseball cap the figure was seen wearing in the footage looked an awful lot like the Florida Gators hat that had been left behind on the floor inside of the office. And so this confirmed for detectives that that hat they had found had very likely been worn by the killer, and it was, along with this surveillance footage, possibly the most valuable piece of evidence that they had. Once they were finished viewing the surveillance footage, Kashino unplugged the power cord and then carefully bagged it into evidence, because he now knew that the killer had very likely yanked it from the wall. Then Kashino handed off the power cord, along with that hat they had found, to crime scene technicians, who prepared these items to be transported back to the crime lab to be swabbed for DNA. 2 days after Larry's murder, the whole community of Hamburg was still frightened because the killer had not been caught. But by this time, the yellow police tape had been pulled from the perimeter of the Toys R Us, and the store was now open for business and crowded with customers. Police also released the surveillance video and images of the baseball cap to the news media on the off chance that somebody in the area might recognize the killer's walk or maybe the clothing they were wearing. Meanwhile, back at the crime lab, technicians had swabbed the DVR power cord and the Florida Gators baseball cap, and they were able to develop what they believed was the killer's DNA profile. They uploaded that DNA profile into CODIS, which is the federal DNA database with loads and loads of DNA profiles. However, after it was uploaded, there was no match. So at this point, the investigators, which now included the FBI, made it their main objective to collect DNA samples from every employee of the Hamburg Toys R Us store, both current employees and former employees, because many, if not all of these people, would not be in the CODIS database. And remember, the leading theory at this point is that, Larry was killed by potentially an active employee or a former employee, somebody with access to this building and an understanding of where the cameras were. And so over the course of the next few weeks, investigators developed a list of Toys R Us past and present employees and also other people connected to Larry and began making contact with them. Police interviewed literally hundreds of people, and not one person they talked to could think of anyone who would have done this. Seemingly nobody had any issues with Larry Wells. And on top of that, it was like nobody had one unkind thing to say about him. He seemed universally loved. But there was one piece of information that surfaced from a witness who had been near the Toys R Us in the early hours of the morning that Larry was killed. And that person recalled seeing a black Chevy Impala sedan parked inside the toy store's parking lot at that time. Now, this Toys R Us, despite having loads of cameras, did not have any dedicated exterior cameras, so there were no images of this vehicle, and this witness did not get a license plate number for the car. Police also could not immediately trace a black Chevy Impala to any of the Toys R Us employees. And so, while some members of the investigative team searched for this car without much to go on, others continued to track down and collect DNA swabs from current and former employees of the Hamburg Toys R Us, and they ended up with a total of 47 DNA samples. It would take several weeks for each DNA profile to be processed by the crime lab, but finally, in mid-August, a month and a half after Larry's murder, the results from all 47 DNA tests came in. And none were a match, meaning not one of those current or former employees had a DNA profile that matched the DNA profile from the hat and the power cord found inside of the crime scene. Detective Kashino and his team were frankly shocked. They expected there to be a match here, but now they just felt lost. It was like months of work had gotten them nowhere. And so once again, they turned to the FBI for help. And they asked the Bureau to draw up a psychological and personality profile of the killer. And so the FBI created that profile and then began reviewing recent arrests in the upstate New York area, and they would find one person who matched their profile almost exactly. The man's name was Patrick Walden, and he had recently been arrested in a neighboring town, and he had just been released from jail. And Kashino soon learned that the vehicle Patrick was driving when he was arrested was registered to his girlfriend's mother, who happened to be an employee at the Hamburg Toys R Us where Larry Wells was killed. And perhaps even more importantly, Cascino discovered that when police searched that vehicle at the time of Patrick's arrest, inside of the car, they found a very long knife. Detective Cascino and the rest of the investigation now considered Patrick to be their primary suspect. He had a connection to the Toys R Us through his girlfriend's mother, he'd been in possession of a weapon that was at least similar to the one used to kill Larry, and he fit the FBI's profile of the killer. So Cascino quickly secured a warrant to put around-the-clock surveillance on Patrick. And on an afternoon, not long after that, an undercover cop tailed Patrick as he drove through town. The undercover cop made sure to stay far enough back not to draw any attention, and he followed Patrick for several minutes, almost at a leisurely pace. Then, the cop noticed Patrick's driver's side window roll down, and so sensing an opportunity here, the cop sped up a bit and leaned forward in his car to get a better look inside of Patrick's car, and he saw Patrick throw something out of the open window onto the street. Now, the cop had no idea what it was, but there was no way he was going to miss this opportunity. And so instead of continuing to trail Patrick, the cop pulled over to the side of the road, he got out, he walked into the middle of the road, being careful of oncoming traffic, and he began looking at the ground for whatever it was Patrick threw, and he couldn't believe his luck, because right there in the middle of the road was a still smoldering cigarette butt, something Patrick had just been smoking. And so it would definitely have a sample of Patrick's DNA on it. And so the undercover cop slipped on a pair of gloves, he crouched down, picked up the butt, carefully extinguished it, dropped it into an evidence bag, and headed back to his vehicle. The cigarette butt was sent to the crime lab for processing, and Detective Cascino and his team thought that was going to be a huge break in the case. But as with all the other DNA samples police had collected to that point, Cascino knew it would still take weeks before test results came back. And during that time, the local news started running stories about how the investigation still hadn't caught the killer, and about how people in the community were tense, feeling as though anyone among them could be the killer. And on top of that, Larry's widow was now more than 5 months pregnant with the couple's second daughter, who would be born without a father. And Larry's widow and the rest of Larry's family feared that the investigation was really losing momentum. And so Cascino was feeling a ton of pressure to crack this case. So while he and his team waited for DNA results on the cigarette butt, they went back to the beginning, reviewing their case files and looking for anything they might have overlooked. And it was at that point that investigators realized there was still one Toys R Us employee on their list that they actually had not obtained a DNA sample from. In fact, every time they had contacted this particular employee to request a sample, this person had an excuse as to why it wasn't a good time. They were either out of town, attending a family event, or just feeling under the weather. And the more time that passed, the more it seemed like this employee was actually deliberately trying to avoid giving their DNA sample. So detectives reached out to this person again and said, hey, we got to do this sample. But once again, the employee said, no, it was not a good time. They said they were still very distraught over everything that had happened. And so for the time being, they had gone to stay at their father's house, so they were not around to give the sample. Cascino and his team believed that they had already been patient enough with this employee, and that the employee's evasiveness was really starting to look quite suspicious. So the investigators located this employee's father's house, and they drove out there hoping to basically force this employee to give a DNA sample. And so the investigators made their way out to this house, they parked outside, got out of their vehicles, and began walking up towards the door. And as they passed by a car that was parked in the driveway, one of the investigators stopped in his tracks. He called out to the others and waved them over to the car he was next to, and then he pointed to something on the rear bumper. It was a Florida Gators bumper sticker. And remember, there was a Florida Gators hat found in the crime scene. That's where the DNA sample was being pulled from. When Cascino saw this, he felt a jolt of excitement. He felt like this could be a big break. And so he and the others walked up to the front door and they knocked, and the employee they were trying to get this DNA sample from answered, appearing very surprised to see the investigators at their father's house. But Cascino was very disarming, and he apologized for bothering them. And he said, look, I know this is not a good time, but the police department really needs to get their DNA right now, just so they can eliminate them from the suspect pool. The employee nodded and said they understood, and then Cascino handed them a swab and asked them to please put it in their mouth and swab their cheek. The employee did that and handed the swab right back, and Cascino dropped it into a plastic vial and sealed it inside. The investigators thanked the employee, then they returned to their vehicles and drove back to the station. Once there, they handed over the swab to the crime lab, but they knew, just like with the Patrick Walden swab and all the others, they would have to wait weeks before this result would come back. While they waited, no major new leads developed. The only thing that came up was investigators learned that Isaac, the employee whose anxiousness had raised suspicions right after the murder, quit his job at Toys R Us, but that didn't really lead the police anywhere. Then finally, in the middle of October, DNA test results came back for Patrick Walden, who had thrown that cigarette butt out the window that the undercover had found, and also for the final Toys R Us employee that police had to go to his father's house to collect that swab for. And one of those two DNA profiles would be a match for the DNA that was found on the Florida Gators hat and the security DVR power cord. And so, more than 3 months after Larry Wells was murdered, Detective Cascino and his team now knew what happened inside the Toys R Us on that Saturday morning in June, and they knew the identity of that figure in the grainy surveillance footage. Based on interviews, DNA samples, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened at the Toys R Us on June 29, 2013. In the dark, early morning hours, the killer drove a black Chevy Impala into the Toys R Us parking lot. They parked the vehicle and then just sat there, scoping out the closed store and planning their entry. After a few minutes, the killer pulled a scarf around their face to conceal their identity. They grabbed their knife off the passenger seat and then got out of their car and walked up to the Babies R Us entrance on the side of the store. The killer walked up to the entrance and then kind of jostled at the door for about 30 seconds until they got it open, and then they went inside. Once inside, they very carefully walked along the walls, ducking behind shelves and doing their best to hide from the store surveillance cameras. The killer eventually reached the manager's office, and they walked inside and closed the door behind them. The killer then walked over to the DVR surveillance system and pulled the power cord out of the wall, disabling all the cameras in the store. 15 minutes later, store manager Larry Wells entered that very same office and right away saw the killer crouched over, attempting to open up the store safe. The killer heard Larry enter and they wheeled around and immediately held up their knife and demanded Larry come over here and open the safe. But Larry, instead of doing that, just reached for the phone to call for help. But at the same time, the killer lunged at Larry and the two men began to struggle. Larry tried desperately to push the killer off of him, but the killer began swinging their arms wildly, at one point stabbing Larry in the shoulder. And when that happened, Larry stumbled forward, and the killer at that point just raised the knife again and brought it down into Larry, stabbing him in the left side of his chest. Larry screamed out in pain and then collapsed into the chair. The killer just stood there for a second, shocked at the sight of Larry now bleeding profusely from the stab wound they had just inflicted on him. And so the killer, who was starting to panic, just forgot about the safe and just turned and ran out of the office, not realizing their baseball cap had fallen off during the attack. Once out of the office, the killer slipped through the store unseen and rushed back outside. They got back into their Impala, sped out of the parking lot, and tossed the knife into a dumpster as they fled the scene. Back in the manager's office, Larry Wells was slipping in and out of consciousness. But in one of his conscious moments, he did manage to trip the store alarm. However, despite that alarm going off, Larry would lay there bleeding for nearly an hour before he was finally discovered and help was called. But unfortunately, by that point, it was already too late. For months, detectives had dealt with one DNA test after another that did not match the hat or the DVR cord. But they did finally get a match from that last employee they had tested, and that employee was Bernie Grusha, the regional vice president of loss prevention for Toys R Us, and the same man who had assisted investigators with the security footage. He literally watched himself maneuver through the store, eventually committing a murder while he sat there with police. On October 16, 2013, police arrested Grusha and charged him with the murder of his friend and employee, Larry Wells. Investigators served a search warrant on Grusha's home, and what they found in the garage of the house brought them much closer to understanding his motives. Police found over $200,000 in stolen Toys R Us merchandise. And what the investigation would soon uncover is that Bernie Grusha, who had been hired to protect Toys R Us assets, was actually robbing Toys R Us blind. He had stolen merchandise from numerous Toys R Us stores in New York and Pennsylvania, and he was then reselling this merchandise on eBay to help chip away at his mountain of debt while continuing to live a lifestyle that was way beyond his means. Investigators learned that his wife became fed up with Grusha's reckless spending, and she also discovered that he was cheating on her, and so their marriage was falling apart. And just 3 weeks before Larry Wells' murder, Grusha had this argument with his wife, after which he had left the room, ran upstairs, entered the master bedroom, got out his 9mm Beretta pistol, and fired it. And his wife ran upstairs and found her husband lying face down on the floor, thinking he must have killed himself, and so she frantically ran to him and turned him over, at which point he looked back at her, completely unharmed, and told her he just wanted to test her and see how she'd react. His wife reacted by calling the police, who quickly showed up, confiscated the gun, and placed Grusha under arrest on charges of criminal possession of a weapon and harassment. His wife then filed a protection order, and so Grusha could not return to the house that he shared with his family. So he went to live with his father as his life continued to fall apart. Grusha had reached a point of total desperation by the time he parked the black Chevy Impala in the Toys R Us parking lot that morning in late June, before taking the life of a man he had hired and considered his friend. It turned out Grusha had rented that black Chevy Impala, and when he arrived back at the store later to assist investigators, he was driving his own car. But police were able to trace that rental car back to him, which further solidified their case. Investigators also discovered that Grusha had actually used his key to unlock the Babies R Us door. He had simply pretended to be prying it open for the security cameras, because he figured that would point investigators to a lower-ranking employee or someone who did not work at the store at all. Grusha eventually admitted to everything he had done in exchange for a reduced sentence. He claimed he did not intend to kill Larry Wells that morning, that he had gone in there to commit a robbery, and then things had simply got out of control, and he had stabbed Larry while flailing about with his knife in his hand. Prosecutors knew there was no way they could prove intent, so they ended up reducing the murder charge to just first-degree manslaughter. And so Bernie Grusha pled guilty and was sentenced to a minimum term of 25 years in prison. On the evening of November 16, 2013, 57-year-old Nancy Pfister stood in front of a crowded room of party guests inside of her house in Aspen, Colorado. Nancy held up a bottle of expensive champagne and called out to get everyone's attention. Her guests turned and watched their host like she was a queen holding court. Nancy had blonde hair and blue eyes and looked like she could have been a model. She told the crowd that she was going to skip winter in the mountains of Colorado and head to the warm beaches of Australia, and she could not think of a better way to spend her last night in town than hanging out with all the people she loved. Nancy thanked everyone for coming, popped open the champagne, and told her guests to have fun. Music began to play, and the guests cheered, and then they all kind of began circulating through Nancy's massive house that sat on over 35 acres of land. And they could look out through these huge floor-to-ceiling windows to get an incredible view of Nancy's property that was covered in aspen trees and surrounded by the snow-capped Rocky Mountains. A lot of Nancy's friends were some of the wealthiest people in Aspen, which was known as one of the wealthiest cities in America, so this was saying something. But the view from Nancy's house was so spectacular, it still made all of her friends a bit jealous. Nancy poured herself a glass of champagne, took a sip, and looked out at everyone with a huge grin on her face. Hosting parties was one of her favorite things to do. In fact, over the decades, Nancy's parties had become sort of legendary. Nancy had inherited millions of dollars and part of the successful ski resort her parents had owned. So Nancy had always had money, and she had always played hostess to the rich and famous who vacationed in Aspen. She had also been briefly engaged to the actor Michael Douglas, she was still good friends with the very famous actor Jack Nicholson, and she'd even hung out with the Dalai Lama. She was also known to have regularly gotten drunk with Hunter S. Thompson, the very famous author of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, who had unfortunately taken his own life, actually not far from Aspen, back in 2005. Nancy walked through the large open front room of her house and began to mingle with some of her guests. But she had her eye on a particular couple that was sitting on the couch. Nancy waved to them, and their faces lit up. Dr. Trey Styler and his wife were in their 60s, but Trey had been dealing with some pretty serious health issues, so he actually looked 10 years older than he was. He often had trouble standing, and walking for long periods of time was a big challenge, but he still had a sharp mind and an amazing sense of humor, which is actually why Nancy liked him so much. She thought he was really funny. Nancy walked over to Trey and his wife, who also happened to be named Nancy, and she sat down next to them on the couch. And then she asked them how they were enjoying the party. They said they were having a great time, but admittedly, they were already plotting how to clean up the house afterwards, and Nancy smiled and laughed. When Nancy had made her plans to travel to Australia, the Stylers had been looking for a new home in the area, and when Nancy found out about it, she suggested they put that off and just rent her place while she was gone. And she actually said they could just move in right away if they wanted to. That way the house would feel more like a home when they were actually on their own. The Stylers had jumped at the chance. They loved Nancy's house, like everybody did, and they always had a great time with Nancy. So the three of them had basically been roommates for the last several weeks, and as much as Nancy was looking forward to traveling in Australia, she was going to miss spending time with the Stylers. And Trey and his wife felt the same way. Trey had been a very successful anesthesiologist before his health forced him to retire, but like Nancy, he had inherited a lot of money, so the two of them shared similar backgrounds and seemed to really connect with each other. Nancy was still talking to the Stylers when she heard someone calling her name. She glanced up and saw her friend, Kathy Carpenter, was standing there looking totally panicked. Kathy told Nancy that she really needed to talk to her right now. Nancy told Trey and his wife she'd catch up with them later, and then she stood up and walked with Kathy to a secluded corner of the room. Other guests watched as Nancy and Kathy huddled together and began to talk. It was something they were all used to seeing, but most of them didn't understand why Nancy even bothered with Kathy. Nancy and the majority of her friends were part of a group that others called Aspen royalty. Basically, they were people who seemed to have enough money to do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. And a lot of them were self-proclaimed snobs who wanted nothing to do with people outside of their own social class. But Nancy was different. She made friends everywhere she went and didn't care if people had money or not. Kathy was a bank teller in town, and every time Nancy had gone to the bank, she thought Kathy seemed like a very nice person. So one day, Nancy had asked Kathy if she'd like to go to lunch, and Kathy said she'd love to. And the two women hit it off and had become close friends ever since. Now, even though Nancy didn't seem to care about their very different social classes, Kathy couldn't ignore it. And so quickly after becoming friends, Kathy began doing things like picking up Nancy's prescriptions at the pharmacy for her and going to the grocery store to make sure Nancy had her food, and she even helped keep track of how much money Nancy spent, even if Nancy didn't seem to care. And so whether Kathy or Nancy realized this, basically, Kathy had become Nancy's personal assistant, even though obviously Kathy was not getting paid to do this and still had to have her job at the bank to make ends meet. And so back at the party in the corner of the room, Nancy asked Kathy what was so urgent that it couldn't wait until after the party. And Kathy said she was just worried that not everything in Nancy's life had been settled before her Australia trip. And also, Kathy wanted to know if Nancy wanted Kathy to look after her house while she was gone. This was something that Kathy kind of automatically did for Nancy anytime Nancy was out of town. Again, sort of acting like her assistant, even though she wasn't. Nancy was sort of annoyed by this. She didn't feel like talking about this right in the middle of the party, and so she tried to just kind of softly end the conversation with Kathy, but Kathy was persistent and really wanted to know what Nancy needed while she was going to be gone. And so finally, Nancy told Kathy that yes, it would be great if you stopped by the house once in a while and made sure her dog was okay. And also, if Trey and his wife, who were going to be staying at Nancy's house, needed anything, well, it would be great if Kathy could help them with that too. And so Kathy nodded, understanding her assignments, and then Nancy took a swig of her champagne, flashed a smile, and then rejoined the party and left Kathy standing all alone in the corner. Three months later, on the morning of February 22nd, 2014, Kathy opened up Nancy's front door with her own key. She walked into the front room, and she found Dr. Trey Styler and his wife waiting for her. Trey sat in a wheelchair with a couple of suitcases at his side, and Nancy's dog was laying at his feet. Over the past few months, Trey's health problems had only gotten worse, and he was really struggling to walk a lot of the time. Kathy looked frazzled, like she often did, and she asked the Stylers if they had everything and if they were ready to go. A few days earlier, Nancy had emailed Kathy to say she was coming home from Australia. When Nancy had left, she actually had not set a return date, at least not officially, but now this email served as letting people know she was coming back home. And so Kathy wanted to make sure everything in the house was perfect for Nancy when she got home, and that meant making sure Nancy had the house to herself. So Kathy had informed the Stylers that they needed to get out of the house and take all their belongings with them so she could straighten up before Nancy got there. In the front room, Trey leaned down, grabbed one of the suitcases, and put it on his lap. Trey's wife grabbed the other suitcase and told Kathy they were ready to go. But she said they were leaving a few things behind that they would want to come back to get. Kathy suddenly was panicked and said they really needed to make sure everything was out of the house. But in a calm, steady voice, Trey told her that everything was fine. He reminded Kathy that they had been paying rent on the house. They were not just guests here. They didn't want to cause any problems, but they were sure Nancy would be okay with having some of their things still in the house just for a few more days. Then Trey pushed himself through the room towards the front door, and his wife and Kathy followed. They made it outside, and right away Trey began to shiver. The sun was shining, but there was snow on the ground, and it was only about 25 degrees Fahrenheit, so right below freezing. Trey had also lost quite a bit of weight recently, which contributed to him feeling cold. His wife helped him into Kathy's car, and then put his wheelchair and their suitcases in the trunk. Then Kathy hopped in the driver's seat and drove the couple a few miles away to the hotel where they were going to stay until their new house was ready. And then after dropping the couple off, Kathy headed back to Nancy's. That evening, Kathy drove to the airport with Nancy's dog in the back seat. She knew Nancy would be thrilled to see him as soon as she landed. A little later, after flying for almost 24 hours and experiencing a massive 16-hour time change, Nancy finally stepped off the plane in Colorado. She somehow felt exhausted, but also completely wired, and she really had no idea what day it was. Kathy met Nancy at the baggage claim and helped her get everything over to the car. Nancy climbed into the back seat, and her dog jumped on her and licked her face. Nancy was glad to be back. When they got back to Nancy's house that evening, even though Nancy was dealing with major jet lag and felt totally exhausted, no matter what she tried, she couldn't fall asleep. So Kathy just stayed with her that night to make sure she really was okay and that if she needed anything, she would go get it. And then for the next 36 hours, Nancy just really couldn't quite fall asleep, and so she was just totally exhausted and miserable. But then finally, on the morning of February 24th, so a day and a half after Nancy got home, she just totally crashed. Kathy stayed in the bedroom with Nancy for a bit, but when it was clear Nancy really had fallen asleep and was not going to wake up anytime soon, Kathy went down to the kitchen, and she made sure Nancy's dog had plenty of food and water, and then she found a piece of paper and a marker, and she made a do not disturb sign. Kathy knew that secretly, Nancy hated being woken up before she was ready, and so she did not want anybody to disturb Nancy. And so Kathy walked outside, and she taped the sign to the front door. Then she got into her own car and drove back to her own apartment. On the morning of February 26th, so 2 days after Kathy left Nancy's house when Nancy had finally fallen asleep, Trey and his wife came back to Nancy's house to get the rest of their stuff. They saw the do not disturb sign that was on the door, and they assumed Nancy had to be sleeping, but they still wanted to get their things, and they also really wanted to talk with Nancy to make sure everything was okay with the house. So Trey's wife used her key and they opened the door, and the second they went inside, they were hit with this horrible smell. Trey covered his mouth and nose and wanted to go back outside, but his wife said she heard something and she rushed to the kitchen. There, she saw Nancy's dog pacing back and forth and squealing. His food and water bowls were empty, and he had used the kitchen floor like a bathroom. Trey's wife looked at the scene completely confused. Nancy could be flighty sometimes and leave town almost on a whim, but she loved her dog and always made sure he was well taken care of anytime she was gone. But Trey's wife told herself, maybe Nancy hadn't heard the dog squealing because she was in a really deep sleep, still worn out from her trip. So she went upstairs, walked down the hall to Nancy's bedroom, opened the door, and went inside. And when she did, she felt even more confused about the whole situation. Because Nancy wasn't in there. And it looked like her bed had been totally stripped, like Nancy had gone to do a load of laundry and never came back or something. Trey's wife immediately headed right back downstairs and found her husband still waiting by the door, and she told him what she saw. So Trey's wife called Kathy at the bank where she was working and filled her in. When Kathy heard what was going on, she said this all sounded really strange because Nancy had been sleeping when she left the house, and Kathy had made sure the dog had plenty of food and water. So did this mean Nancy hadn't checked on the dog in over 2 days? Trey's wife said she would clean it all up, take the dog out, and make sure he was okay and fed before she left, but she was worried about Nancy. Kathy said she felt the same way. So she hung up and called Nancy, but it went straight to voicemail. So she sent Nancy several text messages and also an email. But by 5:30 p.m., when Kathy got off work, she still hadn't heard anything from Nancy. So she drove straight to Nancy's house. A few minutes later, Kathy arrived at Nancy's. She first checked on the dog and then went upstairs to Nancy's bedroom. And when she went inside, she saw the bed was stripped, just like Trey's wife had said. Kathy walked about 15 feet across Nancy's bedroom to a large walk-in closet. Now, this closet was bigger than a lot of people's bedrooms, and Nancy had actually converted it into a meditation room. She had hung Tibetan prayer flags on the wall and filled it with candles and personal keepsakes. Kathy knew that Nancy did not like anyone going in that closet, but she knew she had to go in because she had to find Nancy. And so Kathy first knocked on the door of this meditation room, but it was silent inside. So she eventually reached down and grabbed the doorknob, but when she turned it, she felt that it was locked, and Nancy's key to the closet was nowhere to be found. So Kathy ultimately walked back downstairs, went outside, got in her car, and sped back to her apartment, and there she grabbed her duplicate key to Nancy's walk-in closet that Kathy kept on its own keychain, and then with the key in hand, she drove back to Nancy's house. At about 5:45 p.m., Kathy walked into Nancy's bedroom again, and this time she saw something she'd overlooked. There was a small splash of blood on the headboard of the bed, and when she saw this, Kathy began to shake. Then Kathy slowly turned towards the meditation room, the walk-in closet, and she began walking in that direction. And when she got there with shaking hands, she used her key and opened the door. And when she looked inside, at first, it looked like the way it always did, with all the different keepsakes and the flags and the candles. But right as Kathy was about to leave, she noticed something on the ground. And when she looked more closely, she began to scream. Kathy immediately grabbed her phone and dialed 911. And when the operator answered, Kathy could barely speak. She was basically hyperventilating. But finally, she did manage to shout that her friend, Nancy Pfister, was dead inside of her closet, and she was sure Nancy had been murdered. Kathy's 911 call took the Pitkin County Sheriff's Department by complete surprise. Crime was rare in Aspen, Colorado, and there hadn't been a murder in town in over a decade. And on top of that, almost everybody in the area knew who Nancy Pfister was. She was basically a celebrity in Aspen. If Nancy really had been murdered, the county police knew this would be their highest profile case in a very long time. So they immediately reached out to the state police and the district attorney's office for help. And not long after that, an investigator with the DA's office named Lisa Miller parked her car in the long driveway in front of Nancy's house and stepped outside. Investigator Miller was tall with light brown hair, and she was wearing a gray wool overcoat and dark sunglasses. Miller had a reputation for being a staunch advocate for victims and for being very straightforward when dealing with suspects. From where she was standing, Miller looked around and saw all the huge aspen trees spreading out across Nancy's huge property, and she was also able to look inside of Nancy's house through her large front windows, and it was beautiful inside. And so Miller thought, this is like one of the most beautiful places she'd ever seen if it wasn't for the fact that county police officers were stretching crime scene tape all across the yard. Miller saw a couple of deputies talking with Kathy a few feet from Nancy's front door, and she also saw Sheriff Joey DeSalvo standing nearby with Nancy's dog. Miller waved to DeSalvo and walked over to him. She asked him if he had seen the body yet, but DeSalvo just shook his head, and Miller could tell he was on the verge of tears. DeSalvo said Nancy was a good friend of his. Before he was sheriff, he'd had a bit of a wild side, and actually he and Nancy used to party together. And he also said that he was the one who'd been called in to deal with Hunter S. Thompson's body after the writer had killed himself, and seeing someone he knew covered in blood like that had haunted DeSalvo for years, so he couldn't bring himself to go look at Nancy's body. Miller said she understood and just told him that he would need to tell her everything he knew. DeSalvo nodded and said that Kathy, the friend of Nancy's who had found the body and called 911, had told him that when she went into the bedroom closet, she had found her friend's body on the floor. Nancy's body was wrapped up in some sheets and a carpet, and her hair was matted with blood. That's about all he knew as far as the body was concerned. But there was one more thing that Kathy had told him. Kathy said that she had noticed some of Nancy's pill bottles were missing from her bathroom. Miller thanked DeSalvo, slipped on a pair of gloves, and then walked inside the house with one of the sheriff's deputies. Miller and the deputy headed upstairs and walked directly into Nancy's bedroom. They noticed the bed was stripped, and they saw blood on the headboard. Then they stepped into the closet that had been turned into a meditation room and looked down at the floor. But for a second, they both just stood there confused, because it just looked like there was a blanket and a pile of sheets laying there. And so Miller crouched down, and it wasn't until she was right over the blanket and sheets that she could tell they were actually wrapped around something. Miller kept staring at the pile for a second, and then she asked the deputy if Kathy had mentioned moving the blanket or touching it in some way. But the deputy said, according to Kathy, she had not touched anything in the closet. This made no sense to Miller because at this moment, it was really impossible to tell if what was wrapped up inside of these sheets and this carpet was actually Nancy Pfister's body. And Miller definitely couldn't see any blonde hair matted with blood nearby like Kathy claimed to have seen inside of this closet. Miller nodded to the deputy, and so he crouched down, and together, they began to unwrap the blanket and the sheets. And as they did, they heard a strange sound, like the sheets were rubbing against something plastic. And then finally, once they had unspooled the bedding, they tossed it aside, and what they were left with was blood-stained trash bags wrapped around a dead body. Miller began to remove the trash bag covering the victim's head, and this is when she saw blonde hair matted with blood, just like Kathy had said. Miller finally pulled the trash bag all the way away, revealing the victim's face, and immediately the deputy lowered his head and told Miller that that was definitely Nancy Pfister. Miller wanted to wait for the state forensics team to arrive before handling the body anymore, so she and the deputy stepped out of the closet and began to search the rest of the house. But during the search, Miller didn't find any signs of forced entry or of a robbery. I mean, expensive paintings still hung on the wall, and Nancy's electronics and computer were plainly visible but looked untouched. And so Miller headed back outside into the cold winter air, and she saw Kathy, so she walked over to her and introduced herself, and she told Kathy they would need to talk at length at some point. But for now, Miller said she only had one question. Had Kathy touched the blanket or the sheets on the floor inside of that closet? Kathy shook her head and said no. She said she really had not touched anything in the closet, and as soon as she saw her friend's body on the floor, she called 911. And so Miller thanked her and went back inside of Nancy's house. Not long after Miller's initial sweep of the house, state forensics officers arrived on the scene. They followed Miller to Nancy's bedroom and began searching for prints, and they also took a sample from the blood spatter on the headboard. Then they flipped over the mattress and found several large bloodstains on it. After that, the officers went into the closet and began to do a thorough search of the body. All the while, Miller kept looking back and forth between the closet and the bed. The bloodstains on the headboard and the mattress made it seem like Nancy had been attacked in bed and then dragged, 15 feet or so across the room to the closet. The killer had also flipped the mattress over to try to hide the bloodstains and then clearly wrapped the body up in bedding and trash bags. And this was not an easy task. Just moving Nancy's body around would have been heavy and cumbersome, and there were so many steps the killer had to complete before leaving the house. And so as a result, Miller knew the killer would have needed a lot of time after killing Nancy, and also a lot of strength to pull this off. Or the killer would have needed a partner. And so Miller thanked the forensics officers and headed back downstairs, and she was still taking in everything she'd seen and heard, but at this point, she was sure about one thing. Kathy had lied to the police, because Nancy's body was not visible inside of the closet. And so if Kathy said she had seen her friend's blonde hair matted with blood, that meant either she did move the blankets and the carpet, and that's how she saw it, and then covered it back up, or Kathy just knew Nancy's hair was matted with blood because Kathy had killed her or had assisted in killing her. Investigator Miller knew that the murder of a wealthy socialite would send shockwaves through Aspen, and it would quickly lead to gossip and panic among locals and vacationers, so she didn't waste any time. Not long after Miller searched Nancy's house, she told Kathy to come down to the sheriff's station to meet with her and county and state police investigators. That day, Kathy stepped into the small interview room at the station. Kathy was average height with long brown hair, and she wore jeans and a red sweatshirt. And she looked very upset from the moment she sat down directly across from Miller. Miller spoke calmly and quietly. She thanked Kathy for coming in and then asked her to walk them through all the details of what happened when she went inside of Nancy's house, all the way through to calling 911. Kathy said when she'd gone to Nancy's the first time, she noticed some of Nancy's pill bottles were missing, and she also noticed the closet door, the meditation room, was locked. And then when she went looking for the key to that closet that she knew Nancy always kept in her bedroom, she found it was gone. And so this was all very strange. And so that's what led Kathy to go back to her place, get her own key to the closet, and rush back to Nancy's house. Then suddenly, Kathy's voice trailed off, and she began wailing and heaving and struggling to breathe. The investigators worried she was hyperventilating, like she had during her 911 call. But despite Kathy's hysterics, Miller noticed something about Kathy that was very strange. Even though Kathy was visibly sobbing, Miller couldn't see any tears. Miller did not like to judge how people grieved, but she had seen suspects act like this before. and they often used these huge displays of emotion to try to cover up their own guilt, or to at least avoid answering questions. Finally, when Kathy calmed down, Miller immediately began asking questions. She asked Kathy again if she had touched the bedding or Nancy's body when she went into the closet. Miller wanted to give Kathy a chance to change the story that she'd told her at the house. But Kathy said she had not touched Nancy. When she was in the closet, she had just looked at the floor, saw her friend's bloody hair, and immediately knew Nancy was dead. At this point, Miller sat up straight in her chair. Her height could make her intimidating, but her demeanor always remained totally calm. Miller thought there was a good chance Kathy was lying, but there was also a chance Kathy had been so upset that she really didn't remember everything that happened. People in shock can forget things, so maybe Kathy had partially uncovered Nancy's body, covered it back up, and then sort of blocked it out of her mind. Another deputy in the room pushed the interview forward and asked Kathy if she resented Nancy for her money. Was she angry that she had to run around doing errands for Nancy while never getting paid a dime for it? But Kathy shook her head. She said it wasn't like that. She and Nancy were extremely close and they loved each other. And something about the way Kathy said that struck Miller as strange. She couldn't be sure, but this woman seemed like more than just a broken-hearted friend. So Miller leaned in and asked Kathy if she and Nancy were actually lovers. Kathy looked very surprised by this question, but she took a deep breath and looked very calm for the first time in the interview, and then she said that she and Nancy had been intimate, but only one time and that it didn't matter. They were just friends who cared about each other. Kathy insisted that she was not some kind of jealous girlfriend and that she had nothing to do with Nancy's murder. Miller didn't show any sort of reaction on her face. She had no idea if Kathy was actually telling the truth about being intimate with Nancy only once, but she thought that if it was true, certainly once could have been enough to complicate the relationship. And so after a tense silence, Miller asked if Kathy could think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her friend. Kathy sat there silent. An angry look came across her face, and then she nodded. She said she had a pretty good idea of who wanted to kill Nancy. It was Dr. Trey Styler and his wife. After the interview with Kathy, investigator Miller thought that Kathy was either directly involved with the murder or just knew more than she was letting on. Kathy had easy access to Nancy's house and a key to the walk-in closet where Nancy had been found. Kathy also had a sexual relationship with Nancy at least one time, and she seemed to know details about the body that only the killer would know. But all the evidence pointing at Kathy was still circumstantial, so for the time, police let her go home. Soon after Kathy left, county officers located Trey and his wife at the hotel where they were staying, and they asked them to come to the station. When Trey walked into the interview room for his interview, Miller was taken aback by how frail this man looked. He clearly struggled to walk, and he was extremely underweight for his height. This just was not a guy with the physical strength to murder Nancy, then wrap her up, drag her to the closet, and then flip over a mattress. It just was not possible. But Kathy, in her interview, really seemed to think that Trey and his wife were capable of killing Nancy and had wanted to kill Nancy, so Miller began by asking Trey about his relationship with Nancy and his time living alone inside of her house. Trey would admit that Nancy could be very difficult to deal with as a landlord. She was terrible at keeping records and often thought she was owed money that she had already been paid. But Trey had said that working with Kathy and Nancy's attorney had made things a lot easier, so any issues he might have had with renting the house always got worked out. When Trey's wife had her interview, she basically said the same thing as her husband. And even though she was not frail like her husband, investigators did not think this slight woman in her mid-60s could have physically carried out the murder on her own either. So by the time Trey and his wife left the station, investigators still believed that Kathy was the most likely suspect. And Miller thought there were two key pieces of evidence they needed to find to directly link Kathy to the murder. There were Nancy's missing pills and Nancy's missing key to the closet. On February 28, 2014, 2 days after Nancy's body was discovered, a county sanitation worker walked along a street checking the public trash cans. A lot of mountain towns in Colorado have strict rules about what can and can't be deposited in public trash cans in an effort to keep bears away. And so sanitation workers literally check the trash cans to make sure these rules are being followed. And so this worker opened a trash can out in front of some shops, and right away something caught his eye. In an open bag, he saw several pill bottles. This type of personal trash was not going to attract bears, but it was still not allowed in public trash cans. So he leaned in to grab the bag, and when he got closer, he saw the name on the bottles, Nancy Pfister. Like everybody in the area, the worker knew about Nancy's murder. so he immediately contacted the sheriff's department. Investigator Miller got word that the missing pills had been found, and she couldn't believe her luck. It was like a prayer had been answered. Then, the following day, a man was walking down the sidewalk not far from where the pills had been found, and he saw something on the ground, glinting in the sunlight. He bent down and saw it was a key, and there was a tag on the keychain that said Owner's Closet. He picked it up and handed it over to a county police officer who was parked nearby. And back at the sheriff's department, it did not take long for officers to realize that this key was the missing key to Nancy's meditation room. And so investigators started to feel like they must have a guardian angel or something. In the span of 2 days, 2 random people had located key pieces of evidence that helped break the case wide open. Because the locations where the key and the pill bottles had been found made it pretty clear who had gotten rid of them. So, over the next couple of weeks, investigators followed up on the evidence, shored up their case, and then made an arrest. Then, about 3 months later, in June, Investigator Miller, along with officers from the county and state police, sat in an interview room and listened to the killer's full confession. Based on that confession, the following is a reconstruction of what investigators were told happened to Nancy Pfister on the night of February 24th, 2014. That night, the killer stood at the bottom of Nancy's stairs inside of her house, holding several trash bags and an electrical cord in one gloved hand and a hammer in the other. They walked up the stairs slowly, trying not to make any noise. Once they reached the second floor, they headed down the hall and walked into Nancy's bedroom. The killer saw Nancy asleep in her bed. She had her headphones in, and she was wearing an eye mask to block out any light. This put the killer at ease. It didn't look like Nancy was going to wake up and fight back. So, the killer walked over to the bed and put down the trash bags and the cord, but kept the hammer in their hand. Then they just stood there staring at Nancy as she slept. After taking a breath, the killer slowly raised that hammer up into the air and then smashed it down into Nancy's head. The killer felt Nancy's skull crack, but they immediately raised the hammer again and kept swinging it down at her head and face. As they did, blood splashed against the headboard and ran down into the mattress. Eventually, the killer stopped their frenzied attack and lowered the hammer, and then stared down at Nancy's now dead body. Then they dropped the hammer onto the trash bags, and then took the top blanket off the bed and placed it on the floor. Then the killer quickly pulled the bloody sheets off the bed and threw those on top of Nancy's body, and then they grabbed the corners of the blanket and began to drag the blanket with Nancy on top of it over to the walk-in closet. When they reached the closet, the killer noticed Nancy's key was sticking out of the lock on the closet door. So they dropped the blanket, used the key to open the door, and then dragged Nancy inside the closet. Then they ran back into the bedroom, grabbed the trash bags, and went back into the closet. There, the killer crouched down and wrapped Nancy's head in one of the bags. They cinched it tight around her neck using the electrical cord. Then they also wrapped up her torso and her legs with the other trash bags. Once they were satisfied, the killer also wrapped Nancy in her own bed sheets, as well as her own blanket, and then left her right in the middle of the closet. The killer stood up and looked down at the floor where Nancy was, and to them, it was barely even noticeable that a body was under all those layers. So they stepped out of the closet, closed and locked the door, and pocketed Nancy's key. Then they went back to Nancy's bed and flipped it over so the blood wouldn't show. Then the killer went into the bathroom and took a few pill bottles from the counter. They figured this might make it look like Nancy had just taken off for a few days. Finally, the killer headed downstairs, carrying the hammer and the pills in their hands, and as they exited the house, they could hear the sound of Nancy's dog barking in the kitchen. But they didn't care. They just rushed out to their car, hopped inside, and drove a few miles away to the hotel where they were staying. In the days following Nancy's murder, investigators came to believe that Kathy was involved, because it looked like she had lied and because she knew details that she could not have seen without handling the body. But then, police received those two key pieces of missing evidence, Nancy's pill bottles and her closet key, and they were both found right near the hotel where Trey and his wife were staying. And when investigators followed up with them, they discovered that Trey and his wife's relationship with Nancy had actually totally fallen apart while Nancy was in Australia. Nancy was not just absent-minded when it came to getting her rent like Trey had suggested. Instead, she was aggressive and kind of a bully. She wanted the Stylers to pay several months' rent, which was over $13,000, in cash all at once. But Trey insisted that was not what they had agreed to, and his medical bills were draining his savings, so paying that all at once really was not an option. Over the course of Nancy's trip, both parties got their attorneys involved and started accusing the others of trying to rip them off. So by the time Nancy finally flew back to Colorado, Trey and his wife had made it clear they were very, very angry at her. In fact, they had told Kathy on several occasions that they wished Nancy was dead. And it would turn out Kathy had basically said the same thing to the Stylers. She also seemed fed up with Nancy, specifically the demands Nancy kept putting on her. And she said there was a dark and cruel side to Nancy that really only people close to her saw. Her public perception is she was not this snobby, awful person, but, behind closed doors, at least to Kathy and to the Stylers, she was. When investigators learned all of this, they no longer believed Trey and his wife were innocent. But they also didn't believe that this couple was physically capable of committing this murder without help. So investigators became convinced that the Stylers and Kathy had killed Nancy together. And in March of 2014, police arrested Trey, his wife, and Kathy. But then in June, when all three suspects were behind bars, investigator Miller sat and listened to a full confession. But that confession only came from Trey. He claimed he had planned and carried out the murder all by himself. His wife and Kathy had nothing to do with it. In fact, Trey explained that he'd experienced this insane jolt of adrenaline on the night of the murder, something he had never felt before, that made it feel like he had no health problems. And so he said that was how he was able to kill Nancy with a hammer, drag her body to the closet, and wrap her up in blankets, sheets, and trash bags. And so based on Trey's confession, his wife and Kathy were eventually released from jail. Trey was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison, but in 2015, he hanged himself in his cell. After Trey's death, his wife received a $1 million life insurance payout, and she would go on to write a book about Nancy Pfister's murder. To this day, some people involved in this investigation do not believe Trey Styler acted alone, that basically he confessed in order to protect Kathy and his wife. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.